Sometimes the smallest hands hold the strongest hearts, and sometimes crisis reveals who we are. In a dusty frontier town, where pride runs deep as prejudice, 12-year-old Clara has always been invisible to the wealthy rancher who rides through her neighborhood. But when Mr. Whitmore collapses from his horse in blazing desert heat, Clara doesn't hesitate. She grabs the reins of a massive stallion she's never ridden and races against time to save a man's life. What happens next challenges everything this divided community believes about courage, worth, and who deserves respect. But here's what nobody saw coming. How would this desperate ride change not just 2 lives, but an entire town's understanding of what it means to be brave? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The summer of 1885 settled over Clearwater Springs like a heavy wool blanket, thick and suffocating. From her perch on the wooden steps outside Peterson's general store, 12-year-old Clara Washington could see the entire main street of their frontier town stretched out before her like a dusty ribbon. The heat shimmered off the packed earth road, creating dancing mirages that made the distant desert mountains appear to float above the horizon. Clara's small fingers worked steadily over the white cotton fabric in her lap, following the neat stitches her mother had started earlier that morning. The dress belonged to Mrs. Henley, the banker's wife, and would be finished by evening if Clara kept her pace. Her mother, Esther, had taught her that every stitch carried their reputation, every seam their survival. In their small world above the general store, precision mattered more than speed. "Keep your stitches small and even, child," Esther often said, her own fingers dancing across fabric with the grace of a pianist. Folks remember sloppy work longer than they remember kindness. The worn silver thimble on Clara's middle finger had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had made their living with needle and thread. The metal was smooth now, polished by countless hours of work, and sometimes Clara imagined she could feel the love of all those hands that had worn it before her. From her vantage point, Clara could observe the rhythm of Clearwater Springs without being truly seen. She had learned early that being invisible had its advantages. People spoke freely around children they barely noticed, revealing truths they would never share with adults who mattered. She watched Sheriff Kane making his daily rounds, tipping his hat to the white ladies while offering only curt nods to the handful of black families who had settled here after the war. She observed Dr. Matthews hurrying between house calls, his medical bag always in hand, treating everyone with equal care regardless of the color of their skin or the weight of their purse. But mostly, Clara watched for Mr. Whitmore. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, the wealthy rancher would ride through town on his magnificent black stallion Thunder. Whitmore owned the largest spread in the territory, thousands of acres stretching toward the mountains, where his cattle grazed on government land that he'd claimed through connection and capital. His ranch house, visible from the hills behind town, stood like a monument to prosperity, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wraparound porch and green shutters that never seemed to fade despite the relentless sun. Today, like every day, Clara heard the rhythmic clop of hooves before she saw them. Whitmore sat tall in his saddle, his silver pocket watch chain glinting against his black vest. That watch had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that, a symbol of legacy and respectability that commanded respect wherever it appeared. Clara had overheard him telling Mr. Peterson that the watch was worth more than most folks in Clearwater Springs earned in a year. Whitmore never acknowledged Clara's presence, though she sat in plain sight every afternoon. His pale blue eyes would scan the storefronts, checking his domain like a king surveying his kingdom, but they passed over her as if she were part of the architecture. In his world, she simply didn't exist. "Clara, come help me with this hem," Esther called from inside the store. Clara gathered her sewing and stepped through the doorway into the cooler interior. The general store doubled as their workshop during the day, with fabric and partially completed garments arranged on every available surface. Mr. Peterson, A kind Swedish immigrant with thinning hair and gentle eyes had offered them the space in exchange for mending his clothes and keeping his store clean. It wasn't charity. Esther insisted on earning everything they received, but it was kindness, and in Clearwater Springs, that was rarer than silver. Esther stood beside their work table, holding up a blue dress that would fit a woman twice Clara's size. "Mrs. Crawford needs this for Sunday service." The hem was too long for her new shoes. Clara set down her work and took the marked fabric from her mother's hands. At 28, Esther Washington was still beautiful, despite the lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and long nights by lamplight. Her husband Samuel had died 3 years ago in a riding accident, leaving her with a young daughter and no resources except her skill with the needle. She had transformed grief into determination, building a modest business that kept them fed and housed. "Mama, do you think Mr. Whitmore ever notices us?" Clara asked, settling into the rhythm of hemming. Esther paused in her cutting. "What brings that question to mind?" "He rides past every day, but he never sees me. It's like I'm not even here. Some folks live in different worlds, even when they're standing in the same place," Esther said carefully. "Mr. Whitmore's world is cattle and contracts, land and legacy. Our world is smaller, but it's ours." Clara considered this as she worked. She understood about different worlds. The white children in town went to school, while she learned reading and arithmetic from her mother in the evenings. They played in groups while she entertained herself with imagination and books borrowed from Dr. Matthews. They spoke freely while she had learned the careful dance of politeness that kept black families safe in frontier towns. But despite these differences, Clara felt connected to things beyond her small world. Stray cats appeared at their back door, knowing she would feed them. Birds with broken wings somehow found their way to her gentle hands. Even Thunder, Whitmore's proud stallion, had begun to pause when passing the store, his dark eyes seeming to search for her small figure on the steps. Animals see things differently than people, Esther had observed after watching Thunder's behavior. They judge by heart, not by skin. The afternoon heat was building toward its daily crescendo when Clara returned to her spot on the steps. The sun blazed white-hot in a cloudless sky, and even the hardy desert creatures had sought shade. The town felt drowsy, subdued by temperatures that could kill the unwary. Old-timers spoke of summer days that had claimed travelers and cattlemen alike. Their bodies found days later beside empty water barrels. Mr. Peterson emerged from behind his counter, mopping his forehead with a damp cloth. "Hottest day yet this summer," he announced to no one in particular. "Must be near 110 degrees. Clara noticed how the heat affected everyone differently. The horses moved more slowly, their heads drooping between stops. The dogs sought shade beneath porches and wagons. Even the flies seemed sluggish in the oppressive air, but it was the people who concerned her most. She had seen men collapse from heat exhaustion before, strong men who had underestimated the desert sun's power to drain life from the human body. As 3 o'clock approached, Clara found herself watching the eastern road with unusual intensity. Something felt different about this day, though she couldn't name what it was. The heat seemed to press down like a living thing, and the air felt thick enough to swim through. In the distance, she could see the heat waves dancing off the desert floor like ghosts. Then she heard them, the familiar hoofbeats of thunder approaching from the direction of the Whitmore ranch. But today the rhythm seemed off, less steady than usual. Clara set down her sewing and stood, shading her eyes with one hand as she peered down the dusty road. Mr. Whitmore was coming, his silver pocket watch chain catching the merciless sunlight, but something was wrong. Even from a distance, Clara could see that he was swaying in his saddle, his usually perfect posture compromised by something. More dangerous than pride, Thunder's hooves struck the packed earth in an uneven rhythm that made Clara's heart quicken with concern. Mr. Whitmore had always ridden with military precision, his back straight and shoulders squared, but today he listed to one side like a ship taking on water. Even from 50 yards away, Clara could see the dark patches of sweat staining his white shirt and the way his hat sat askew on his graying head. The heat had been building all morning, rising from the desert floor in waves that distorted vision and stole breath from anyone foolish enough to venture into direct sunlight. The temperature gauge outside Peterson's store had climbed past 110 degrees an hour ago, and the mercury continued its relentless climb toward numbers that could prove fatal to man and beast alike. Clara dropped her sewing and stood, her bare feet burning on the sun-scorched wooden steps. "Mr. Peterson," she called through the open doorway, never taking her eyes off the approaching rider. "Something's wrong with Mr. Whitmore." The store owner emerged, squinting into the blazing afternoon light. "Merciful heavens," he whispered, recognizing immediately what Clara had seen. "He's about to fall." Whitmore swayed more dramatically now, his left hand gripping the saddle horn, while his right held the leather reins with fingers that seemed to be losing their strength. Thunder, sensing his rider's distress, began to dance nervously beneath him, the massive stallion's dark coat glistening with sweat and foam. "Should I fetch Sheriff Kane?" Mr. Peterson asked, but before Clara could answer, disaster struck. Whitmore's body suddenly went limp, pitching forward against Thunder's neck like a sack of grain. The proud rancher's silver pocket watch slipped from his vest, dangling by its chain as his unconscious form threatened to slide from the saddle. Thunder reared up on his hind legs, eyes rolling white with panic, and for a terrifying moment it seemed certain that Whitmore would be thrown to the ground and trampled by 1,500 pounds of frightened horse, the small crowd that had gathered outside the store. Mrs. Henderson clutching her shopping basket, young Tom Mueller with his mouth hanging open, and old Mr. Kowalski leaning heavily on his walking stick stood frozen in shock. These were people who had faced Indian raids and prairie fires, but the sight of their town's most powerful man collapsing in broad daylight left them paralyzed with uncertainty. Not Clara. Without conscious thought, she leaped from the steps and raced toward the panicking horse. Her bare feet flew over the scorching ground, sending up small clouds of dust with each step. Behind her, she could hear Mr. Peterson shouting her name, and her mother's voice calling from somewhere inside the store. But the sounds seemed to come from another world. Thunder was spinning in circles now, trying to rid himself of the dead weight on his back, while simultaneously fighting his training not to harm his rider. Foam flew from his mouth as he snorted and stamped, his powerful hooves striking the ground like hammers. Most adults would have retreated from such a dangerous display of equine panic, but Clara saw only a terrified animal in need of guidance. "Easy. Boy!" she called out as she approached, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. "Easy now." The stallion's dark eyes fixed on her small figure, and something in her calm tone seemed to penetrate his panic. She had never ridden a horse in her life, had never even touched one, but some instinct deeper than experience guided her movements as she reached for Thunder's bridle. "Clara, no!" her mother screamed from the store's doorway. "Get away from there!" But Clara was already moving, her small hands grasping the leather reins that represented not just control of a powerful animal, but the transfer of authority from one world to another. The leather was warm and slick with the horse's sweat, the braided strands worn smooth by years of Whitmore's confident grip. Now they belonged to a 12-year-old girl who had never owned anything more valuable than a silver thimble, with movements that surprised everyone watching, including herself. Clara grabbed Thunder's mane and swung herself up behind the unconscious rancher. Her slight weight barely registered on the massive horse, but her presence seemed to calm him immediately. The spinning stopped, the wild eyes focused, and Thunder stood trembling but still. "Good boy," Clara whispered, adjusting her position to better support Whitmore's slumping form. "Now we need to get him to Dr. Matthews." The unconscious man was heavy against her small frame, his body radiating heat like a furnace. She could feel his labored breathing and see the alarming pallor of his skin beneath the desert tan. Whatever had struck him down, heat exhaustion, heart trouble, or simple exhaustion, time was becoming his enemy. Clara wrapped one arm around Whitmore's waist to hold him in the saddle while gripping the reins with her free hand. The leather felt alive in her fingers, connecting her to Thunder's strength and speed. She had watched Whitmore ride these streets hundreds of times, had studied the way he held his hands and positioned his body, never imagining that observation would become preparation for this moment. "Move aside," she called to the growing crowd as Thunder began to respond to her gentle pressure on the reins. "We're going to Dr. Matthews." The townspeople scattered like startled birds as Clara guided Thunder into a careful walk down Main Street. Every step was a negotiation between her inexperience and the horse's training, between her determination and the very real danger of both riders ending up trampled in the dust. Mrs. Henderson pressed her hand to her heart as they passed. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "A child trying to save a grown man?" "Not just any child," Mr. Peterson corrected grimly. "That's little Clara Washington, and she's got more courage in her little finger than most men have in their whole body." Behind them, Esther Washington stood in the store's doorway with tears streaming down her face, not from fear, though terror certainly gripped her heart, but from a fierce pride that threatened to overwhelm her. Her daughter, the invisible girl who sat on the steps every afternoon, was attempting something that would have challenged experienced riders. Thunder seemed to understand the urgency of their mission. The great stallion moved with careful precision, his hooves finding sure footing on the uneven road, while his rider clung to consciousness and control. Clara could feel the horse's muscles bunching and releasing beneath her, could sense his willingness to trust this small stranger who had appeared in his moment of confusion. "That's it. Thunder," she encouraged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Matthews is just 2 blocks away. We can do this." Whitmore stirred slightly against her arm, mumbling something incomprehensible about cattle and water. His silver pocket watch continued to dangle from its chain, catching the sunlight and throwing bright reflections onto the dusty ground below. The watch that had marked the hours of his authority now swung freely, its steady ticking replaced by the urgent rhythm of Thunder's hooves, carrying him toward salvation. As they approached the doctor's office, Clara could see a crowd gathering ahead. Word of the crisis had spread through Clearwater Springs with the speed that only small towns could manage, and it seemed like half the population had come to witness this unprecedented sight. A young black girl commanding the horse and perhaps the life of the town's most powerful white man. The leather reins in Clara's hands had become more than strips of braided cowhide. They were the threads connecting past to present, pride to humility, and power to responsibility. In taking hold of them, she had grasped something far greater than she could understand. The possibility that courage could transcend every boundary their divided world had built. Clara's worn brown shoes, patched twice by her mother's careful hands, pressed against Thunder's flanks as she struggled to maintain her seat while supporting Whitmore's unconscious weight. The leather soles, thin from months of wear, offered little grip against the horse's smooth coat, and she found herself sliding with each of Thunder's movements. Her small legs barely reached around the stallion's broad barrel, making her feel like a sparrow trying to ride an eagle. The shoes had been new 2 years ago, a rare extravagance purchased with money Esther had saved by taking in extra sewing. They were Clara's only good pair, reserved for church services and special occasions, but now they carried her through the most important journey of her young life. Each step Thunder took jarred through the thin soles, reminding her of how far she was from the familiar ground of her daily routine. Whitmore's body had become a dead weight against her left arm, his breathing shallow and labored. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, even through his sweat-soaked shirt, and the alarming limpness of his limbs told her that whatever had felled him was serious. Dr. Matthews was still a full block away, and every second felt like an hour under the blazing sun. "Easy now," Clara whispered to Thunder, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the horse or herself. Just a little farther. The crowd following them had grown with each passing storefront. She could hear their voices rising in a mixture of amazement and concern, some calling out encouragement, while others muttered disapproval. The sound created a strange symphony of human emotion that seemed to press against her from all sides. "Look at that little girl," marveled Mrs. Fisher, the German baker's wife. "She's handling that horse like she was born to it." "It's not natural," countered Mr. Williams, the hardware store owner. "A child has no business trying to control a beast like that. She'll get them both killed." "Better than standing around doing nothing while a man dies," shot back Tom Muller's father, who had witnessed Clara's decisive action from the beginning. The voices swirled around Clara like dust devils, some supportive, others critical, but all amazed by what they were witnessing. She had spent 12 years being invisible to most of these people, and now she felt the weight of every eye in Clearwater Springs, focused on her small figure perched atop the town's most magnificent horse. Her mother's voice cut through the crowd noise like a blade. "Clara, be careful, baby." Clara glanced back to see Esther running down the street, her dark dress billowing behind her as she struggled to keep pace with Thunder's steady walk. Her mother's face showed a complex mixture of terror and pride that Clara had never seen before, the expression of a woman watching her child attempt something that could either save a life or end. "I'm all right, Mama," Clara called back, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Every muscle in her small body strained to maintain her position, and Whitmore seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Thunder, despite his cooperation, remained a barely controlled force beneath her, his power evident in every step. The physical challenge was overwhelming. Clara had never fully appreciated the strength required to ride a horse until now, when failure meant not just embarrassment, but potentially death for the man she was trying to save. Her legs ached from gripping Thunder's sides, her arms burned from supporting Whitmore's weight, and her hands were already developing blisters from the unfamiliar pressure of the leather reins. But even as her body protested, something deeper sustained her. She could hear her mother's voice in her memory, speaking the words that had guided Clara through every difficult moment of her young life. "When someone needs help, you help them. Doesn't matter who they are or what they've done. That's how we know we're still human." Those words had been spoken over countless evening meals, during bedtime conversations, and in quiet moments when Esther thought Clara wasn't listening. They had become part of Clara's foundation, as essential to her character as breathing was to her body. Now they gave her strength to continue when everything in her wanted to slide. Down from Thunder's back and run to her, Mother's protective arms. Thunder began to respond to her touch, in ways that surprised both Clara and the watching crowd. The great stallion's ears swiveled back toward her voice when she spoke, and his pace adjusted to her gentle pressure on the reins. It was as if some invisible connection had formed between the frightened girl and the powerful horse. A partnership born of necessity, but growing into something deeper. "Would you look at that?" breathed Sheriff Kane, who had emerged from his office to see what was causing the commotion. "That horse is actually listening to her." "Animals know things we don't," observed Dr. Matthews, who had spotted the approaching drama from his office window and was now standing ready in his doorway. "That child has a gift." Clara felt Thunder's rhythm change slightly, his stride becoming more confident as he sensed her growing assurance. The horse seemed to understand that she was trying to help his fallen master, and his cooperation made her believe that perhaps she could actually succeed in this impossible task. The street seemed endless, each storefront a milestone in their desperate journey. Past Murphy's saloon, where the afternoon drinkers had spilled onto the boardwalk to watch the spectacle. Past the church, where Reverend Thompson stood with his mouth agape. Past the schoolhouse, where the teacher, Miss Adams, had brought her students to the window to witness something they would remember for the rest of their lives. With each step, Clara felt the social order of Clearwater Springs shifting beneath her worn brown shoes. The careful boundaries that had defined her place in the community were being trampled by Thunder's hooves, and she could sense the discomfort this created in some of the watching adults. "Someone should stop this," muttered Mrs. Crawford, the banker's wife. "It's not proper." "What's not proper is letting a man die while we worry about propriety," replied Mrs. Patterson. The blacksmith's widow, surprising everyone with her support. The divide in the crowd reflected a larger division in the town's soul. Some saw only a black child overstepping her place, while others recognized courage in action, regardless of its source. Clara felt the weight of both perspectives, but her mother's teachings and her own moral compass kept her focused on the only thing that truly mattered: getting Mr. Whitmore to the doctor before it was too late. As Dr. Matthews's office grew closer, Clara allowed herself to believe that they might actually succeed. Thunder continued to respond to her guidance. Whitmore continued to breathe, and her own strength, though waning, remained sufficient for the task. Her worn brown shoes, carrying her through this moment that would define not just her own future, but the character of her entire community, had become instruments of destiny. The girl, who had spent her life being overlooked, was now the center of everyone's attention. And though the weight of that scrutiny was almost as heavy as the unconscious man in her arms, Clara Washington had found her moment to matter. The weekly edition of the Clearwater Springs Gazette lay abandoned on Mr. Peterson's counter, its headline about grain prices and cattle reports suddenly insignificant compared to the drama unfolding in the street outside. Editor Robert Thornfield had been setting type for Thursday's edition when the commotion drew him to his window, and now he watched with the keen eye of a man who understood that some stories changed everything they touched. Clara urged Thunder into a faster pace as they approached the heart of Main Street, her confidence growing with each successful step. The stallion's powerful strides ate up the distance toward Dr. Matthews' office, but the journey felt both eternal and fleeting, time moving too slowly to ease her fear for Whitmore's life, yet too quickly for her to fully process what she was attempting. The crowd had organized itself into two distinct groups as they moved down the street. Those who supported Clara's desperate rescue attempt had begun clearing obstacles from Thunder's path, while those who disapproved stood with arms crossed and lips pursed, their silence as telling as any spoken criticism. "Make way," called out Jake Harrison, the young blacksmith who had taken over his father's shop. He rolled a wheelbarrow full of horseshoes out of the street and waved Clara forward. "Clear path to the doctors." Mrs. O'Brien, the Irish laundress, used her considerable bulk to shoulder aside two men who were blocking the boardwalk. "Move yourselves," she commanded in her thick brogue. "That child's trying to save a life, and you're standing around like fence posts." But resistance came from other quarters. Mrs. Crawford, the banker's wife, made a point of turning her back as Clara passed, her posture radiating disapproval. "Mark my words," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "no good will come of this. Children should know their place." "And what place is that?" demanded Martha Patterson, stepping forward with her hands on her hips. "Standing aside while a man dies because we're too worried about propriety to act." The tension between these opposing viewpoints created an electric atmosphere that seemed to charge the very air around Clara. She could feel the weight of the community's conflicted emotions pressing down on her as surely as the desert sun. But she forced herself to focus on Thunder's steady rhythm beneath her and the precious burden she carried. Whitmore stirred against her arm, his head rolling back as consciousness briefly surfaced. "Water," he mumbled, the word barely audible. "Cattle." "Need water. Hold on, Mr. Whitmore," Clara whispered close to his ear. "We're almost there." His eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and confused. When they settled on Clara's face, she saw something she had never witnessed before: genuine human vulnerability in the man who had always seemed untouchable. For that brief instant, the barriers of race and class and social position dissolved, leaving only two people connected by need and compassion. Thunder snorted and shook his great head, foam flying from his mouth as he sensed the urgency of their mission. Clara felt the horse's muscles bunching beneath her, his every movement speaking of barely contained power waiting for her direction. The connection between them had grown stronger with each passing minute, as if the crisis had awakened something in both girl and horse that had been sleeping until this moment. "You're doing fine, boy," she murmured, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised her. Just like your heart knows what to do, behind them, Esther Washington had organized an impromptu support network of women who understood that crisis transcended social boundaries. Mrs. Fisher brought a wet cloth for Whitmore's forehead, while Mrs. Patterson carried a jar of cool water. Even Mrs. Henderson, despite her obvious nervousness about the social implications, had joined the group rushing toward Dr. Matthews' office. "That's my daughter," Esther told anyone who would listen, her voice thick with pride and terror. "That's my Clara, and she's got more courage than sense, but she's doing what's right." The physical toll of the rescue was becoming apparent in Clara's small frame. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the shade provided by her calico bonnet, and her arms trembled from the constant effort of supporting Whitmore's weight while controlling Thunder's movements. Her back ached from the unnatural position, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but something deeper than physical strength sustained her. With each of Thunder's hoofbeats, she felt more connected to something larger than herself, not just to the horse beneath her or the man in her arms, but to the very essence of what it meant to be human in a world that often forgot its own humanity. Dr. Matthews appeared in his doorway, medical bag in hand and sleeves already rolled up for action. "Bring him straight in," he called out, his professional calm providing an anchor of certainty in the emotional storm surrounding Clara's rescue attempt. "Mrs. Washington, I'll need boiled water and clean bandages." The doctor's immediate acceptance of Esther's help, despite the social conventions that usually kept black families at arm's length from white establishments, showed Clara that this crisis was reshaping more than just her own place in the community. Even Dr. Matthews, who had always been kind but professionally distant, was setting aside the usual barriers in service of saving a life. Almost there. "Thunder!" Clara breathed, and the great stallion seemed to understand. His stride smoothed into a careful walk as they approached the doctor's office, his wild energy channeled into precise movement that would deliver his passengers safely to their destination. The crowd that had followed them now filled the street in front of Dr. Matthews' office, their faces reflecting the full spectrum of human emotion. Some wept openly at the sight of such courage in one so young. Others maintained stern expressions that suggested they still disapproved of the whole situation. But all of them, supporters and critics alike, found themselves witnessing something that would be remembered and retold for generations. Editor Thornfield, still watching from his window, knew that Thursday's edition of the Clearwater Springs Gazette would need a completely new front page. The story of grain prices and cattle reports would be pushed aside for something far more significant, the tale of how a 12-year-old girl had challenged everything their community thought it knew about courage, dignity, and human worth. As Thunder's hooves finally stopped before Dr. Matthews' door, Clara felt time rushing back to normal speed after what seemed like hours, suspended in desperate action. The most difficult part of their journey was over, but she sensed that the larger story of what this moment would mean for Clearwater Springs was just beginning. Thunder's great hooves came to rest before Dr. Matthews' wooden steps with the careful precision of a ship finding harbor in a storm. Clara's arms finally released their death grip on Whitmore's unconscious form as willing hands reached up to help lower the rancher from the saddle. The moment her responsibility shifted to others, every muscle in her small body seemed to surrender at once, leaving her swaying with exhaustion atop the magnificent stallion. "Easy there, child," Dr. Matthews said gently, reaching up to help Clara down. "You've done something remarkable here." As her worn brown shoes touched solid ground again, Clara's legs nearly buckled. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the desperate ride began to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made her feel like she might collapse beside the man she had just saved. Her mother materialized beside her instantly, strong arms encircling her daughter in an embrace that conveyed both relief and overwhelming pride. "My brave girl," Esther whispered, her voice thick with tears she had been holding back during the entire ordeal. "My brave, foolish, wonderful girl." Dr. Matthews and two other men carried Whitmore into the office, his unconscious form looking pale and fragile in the afternoon light. As they disappeared through the doorway, Clara caught a glimpse of something that would haunt her for days, the small brown medicine bottle that fell from Whitmore's vest pocket and rolled across the floor with a sound like scattered secrets. Inside the doctor's office, the air was cooler and filled with the familiar scents of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs. Dr. Matthews worked with efficient urgency, checking Whitmore's pulse, listening to his heart, and examining his eyes for signs of heat stroke or more serious complications. What he discovered in those first few minutes changed everything. "Mrs. Washington," he called to Esther, who was tending to Clara's scraped hands and sunburned face on a chair near the window. "Could you fetch that brown bottle from the floor? And please, both of you come here for a moment." Esther retrieved the small medicine bottle, reading the faded label with growing understanding. "Digitalis," she said quietly. "For the heart," Dr. Matthews nodded grimly. "Mr. Whitmore has been treating a serious heart condition for months, perhaps longer. This bottle should have been full. He's been missing doses. Combined with the heat and physical exertion," he let the implication hang in the air like smoke. And Clara looked at the unconscious rancher with new eyes. The proud man who had ridden through town every day, commanding respect with his bearing and wealth, had been hiding a vulnerability that could have killed him at any moment. The medicine bottle, small and brown and ordinary, represented a secret that Whitmore had guarded more carefully than his silver pocket watch or his sprawling ranch. "Will he live?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks to you, most likely yes," Dr. Matthews replied. 10 more minutes in that heat, and we'd be planning a funeral instead of a recovery. As if summoned by the mention of his mortality, Whitmore's eyelids fluttered open. His pale blue eyes, usually so commanding and certain, now seemed confused and unfocused as they tried to make sense of his surroundings. His gaze wandered across the ceiling, the medical equipment, Dr. Matthews's concerned face, and finally settled on the small black girl sitting beside his bed. "What?" he began, his voice cracked and dry. "How did I—" "You collapsed from heat exhaustion and missed heart medication," Dr. Matthews explained gently. "This young lady saved your life by getting you here in time." Whitmore's eyes widened as the doctor's words penetrated his confusion. He stared at Clara with an expression that cycled through disbelief, embarrassment, and something approaching wonder. For 30 years, he had ridden past this child without acknowledgement, had lived in a world where her existence simply didn't register. Now his life had been preserved by hands he had never bothered to notice. "You!" he said, struggling to sit up before Dr. Matthews firmly pressed him back down. "You rode thunder?" Clara nodded, suddenly feeling shy under the direct attention of a man who had always seemed as remote as the mountains on the horizon. "He's a good horse," she said simply. "He knew you needed help." Outside, the crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown larger as word of the unprecedented rescue spread through Clearwater Springs like wildfire. Voices drifted through the open windows, some praising Clara's courage, others debating the propriety of what had occurred, all of them processing a story that challenged their understanding of their own community. "Did you see how that horse responded to her?" marveled Jake Harrison. "Like they'd been riding together for years." "It's not natural," insisted Mrs. Crawford, though her voice carried less conviction than before. "A child has every business saving a life," interrupted Martha Patterson. "Maybe more business than the rest of us, since she's the only one who acted." Whitmore caught fragments of this debate, and each overheard comment seemed to chisel away at something inside him. His pride, built over decades of success and social position, was struggling to accommodate the reality that his survival depended on the courage of someone his worldview had rendered invisible. "Why?" he asked Clara, his voice still weak but gaining strength. "Why did you help me?" Clara looked puzzled by the question, as if he had asked her why water was wet or why the sun was bright. "Because you needed help," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. Mama always says that when someone needs help, you help them. Doesn't matter who they are. The simplicity of her answer hit Whitmore with the force of a physical blow. No calculation of social advantage, no expectation of reward, no complex moral reasoning, just the basic human impulse to preserve life when it was threatened. It was a purity of motive that his adult world of contracts and hierarchies had long since forgotten. Dr. Matthews drew the brown medicine bottle from his pocket and set it on the bedside table with deliberate emphasis. "You'll need to take this regularly, Mr. Whitmore. No more missed doses, and no more riding in extreme heat without water. Your heart won't tolerate such neglect again." The medicine bottle sat between them like a bridge between two worlds, Whitmore's hidden vulnerability and Clara's visible courage. In saving his life, she had also exposed the fragility beneath his pride, while he was slowly beginning to recognize the strength that had always existed beneath her. Supposed insignificance, as consciousness fully returned, and the implications of what had happened began to settle into his mind. Whitmore found himself looking at Clara Washington not as an invisible child from a different world, but as the person who had given him back his life when he had never even given her back a simple nod of acknowledgement. That evening, as Clara settled back into her familiar routine of sewing by lamplight, the steel needle in her fingers seemed to carry extra weight. The needle had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had made their living one careful stitch at a time. Tonight, as Esther guided it through the fabric of Mrs. Crawford's Sunday dress, the small tool seemed to whisper stories of its own, tales of precision born from necessity, strength hidden in delicate things, and the power of hands that knew their purpose. Whitmore spent the night in Dr. Matthews's office, propped up on pillows that did little to ease the discomfort in his chest or the turmoil in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's small hands gripping Thunder's reins, heard her voice calming his frightened horse, felt the certainty in her movements as she guided them both to safety. The images played like a magic lantern show against his closed eyelids, each repetition making the reality more difficult to dismiss. "Couldn't sleep either?" Dr. Matthews asked, entering the room with a fresh pot of coffee and the weary expression of a man who had delivered too many difficult truths in one day. "Keep thinking about what happened," Whitmore admitted, his voice still hoarse from the day's ordeal. "That little girl, Clara, she risked everything for me, and I've never even acknowledged her existence." Dr. Matthews settled into the chair beside the bed, pouring coffee for both of them. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us who we really are, and who others are, for that matter." Across town, word of the rescue had spread through Clearwater Springs like water through cracked earth, seeping into every conversation and dividing the community along lines that hadn't been clearly drawn before. In Murphy's saloon, men who had witnessed the event retold it with growing embellishment, while women gathered in kitchen circles to debate what it all meant. "That Washington girl has more grit than most grown men," declared Tom Muller's father, raising his glass in a toast that half the saloon joined and half pointedly ignored. "It's not about grit," countered Mr. Williams, the hardware store owner. "It's about knowing your place. Children shouldn't be taking charge of situations like that, especially—" He let the sentence trail off, but everyone understood the words he hadn't spoken. "Especially what?" challenged Jake Harrison, the young blacksmith whose own hands were stained with honest work. "Especially when they're the only ones brave enough to act." The debate raged in parlors and porches throughout the town, revealing fault lines in the community that had existed beneath the surface for years. Some saw Clara's actions as heroic, a demonstration of character that transcended social boundaries. Others viewed them as a dangerous disruption of the natural order, a precedent that could lead to all manner of uncomfortable changes. At the Washingtons' small apartment above Peterson's store, Esther worked by the light of 2 oil lamps, her needle flying through fabric with a rhythm born of decades of practice. But tonight, her usual steady pace was interrupted by moments when she would pause, staring into the middle distance as she processed the events of the day. "Mama, why are some folks upset about what I did?" Clara asked from her spot at the small table, where she was mending a torn apron by copying her mother's careful stitches. Esther's needle paused mid-stitch. "Some people are more comfortable when everything stays the same," she said carefully. "When folks act outside what others expect, it makes them nervous. But I just helped Mr. Whitmore. Anybody would have done the same thing." "No, child," Esther said softly, resuming her sewing. "Not anybody. That's what makes it special, and that's what makes some people uncomfortable." The delicate steel needle in Esther's fingers seemed to trace not just seams in fabric, but connections between past and future, fear and pride, protection and freedom. She had spent Clara's entire life trying to keep her daughter safe by teaching her to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention that could bring trouble. Now Clara had done the most visible thing imaginable, and Esther found herself torn between terror at the exposure and fierce pride at her daughter's courage. Dr. Matthews had spent the evening counseling Whitmore about more than just his heart condition. "You'll need to change more than your medication schedule," he warned. "The stress that brought this on, the way you've been driving yourself, isolating yourself, it's killing you as surely as any disease." "I've got responsibilities," Whitmore protested. "The ranch, the men who work for me, the debts and contracts. And what good are you to any of them if you're dead?" Dr. Matthews asked bluntly. "That little girl didn't save your life so you could waste it worrying about cattle prices and land deals." Meanwhile, Clara discovered a small bird with a broken wing beneath the store's back steps. Without hesitation, she created a makeshift nest from an old cloth and began feeding it drops of water from her fingertip. The bird's trust came quickly, as if it recognized in her the same gentle strength that had calmed thunder during the crisis. "She's got a gift," Esther observed, watching her daughter tend to the injured creature. Animals know things about people that people don't know about themselves. As the night deepened, Whitmore found himself wrestling with the decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Social convention dictated that he return to his normal routine, perhaps send a modest gift through intermediaries, and let the whole incident fade into local legend. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of honor and debt. The brown medicine bottle on his bedside table caught the lamplight, reminding him of how close he had come to death and how completely his life now depended on the courage of someone his world had trained him to overlook. The conventional response felt suddenly inadequate, even cowardly. "Doc," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, "I need to thank that girl properly. Not the way society says I should, but the way a man thanks someone who saved his life." Dr. Matthews looked up from his medical journal, understanding immediately the magnitude of what Whitmore was suggesting. In a town like Clearwater Springs, a wealthy white rancher visiting a black family's home would be more than unprecedented. It would be revolutionary. "That might cause quite a stir," the doctor warned. "Good," Whitmore replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Maybe this town needs stirring up." Esther's needle continued its precise path through the fabric, each stitch a small act of faith in a future where her daughter's courage might be valued more than her color, where character might matter more than convention. She had no way of knowing that across town, the man Clara had saved was preparing to take a step that would test everything their divided community claimed to believe about honor, gratitude, and human worth. The knock on the door came at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, each rap measured and deliberate like everything else about Jefferson Whitmore. Clara, who had been helping her mother sort buttons for Mrs. Fisher's dress order, looked up in surprise at the sound. In their 3 years above Peterson's store, no one had ever knocked on their door with such formal authority. Esther's hands stilled on the fabric in her lap, her face showing the wariness of a woman who understood that unexpected visits from powerful white men rarely brought good news. "Who could that be?" she murmured, setting aside her work and smoothing her dress with nervous fingers. Clara peered through the small window and gasped. "Mama, it's Mr. Whitmore, he's here!" The entire town seemed to pause in its daily rhythm as word spread that Jefferson Whitmore, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, was standing on the doorstep of the black seamstress who lived above the general store. Curtains twitched in windows across the street, and conversations stopped mid-sentence as people processed this unprecedented breach of social protocol. Esther took a deep breath and opened the door, offering the careful smile she reserved for white customers who had the power to affect their livelihood. "Mr. Whitmore," she said politely. "How are you feeling, sir?" "Much better, thanks to your daughter," Whitmore replied, removing his hat with the same reverence he would show entering a church. "Mrs. Washington, I've come to thank Clara properly for what she did yesterday. Might I come in?" The request hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. In all her years in Clearwater Springs, Esther had never had a white man ask permission to enter her home. Most would either barge in assuming welcome or stay outside assuming they weren't. Whitmore's courteous request suggested something had fundamentally changed in him. "Overnight, of course," Esther said, stepping aside. "Please, have a seat." Clara watched from the corner as Whitmore entered their modest living space, his eyes taking in the neat arrangement of furniture, the carefully mended curtains, and the evidence of Esther's sewing business organized with professional precision. Everything about their home spoke of dignity maintained despite limited means, of pride expressed through careful attention to detail. "Miss Clara," Whitmore said, turning to face the girl who had saved his life, "I owe you a debt I'm not sure I can ever repay." Clara looked up at him with the same direct gaze she had used while controlling Thunder, unintimidated by his height or status. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Whitmore. I'm just glad you're feeling better." Her simple honesty seemed to disarm him completely. In his world of contracts and calculations, genuine selflessness was so rare that he struggled to respond to it. "Your mother has raised a remarkable young woman," he said to Esther. "Your sewing work is exceptional, too. I've heard folks talk about the quality of your craftsmanship." "Thank you, sir," Esther replied, though her posture remained cautious. Years of navigating relationships with white employers had taught her to be grateful for compliments while remaining alert for the conditions that usually followed them. Whitmore's gaze continued to sweep their home. It settled on something that made him stop mid-sentence. On the small table beside Esther's sewing chair sat a faded daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame, the kind of photograph that frontier families treasured as their only visual connection to lost loved ones. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the photograph. Esther nodded, though Clara noticed her mother's hands clasping together tightly in her lap. Whitmore picked up the frame with careful reverence, studying the image of a tall, lean black man standing beside a magnificent horse. The man's stance spoke of confidence and expertise, his hand resting on the horse's neck with the easy familiarity of someone born to work with animals. Whitmore's face went pale as recognition dawned. "Samuel," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer. "Samuel Washington. You knew my father?" Clara asked, her voice suddenly urgent with curiosity about the man she barely remembered. "Knew him?" Whitmore set the photograph down with trembling hands. "Clara, your father was the finest horse trainer I ever employed. He worked for me for 5 years, and I've never found anyone who could match his skill with difficult animals." The revelation hit the small room like lightning. Clara stared at the photograph with new eyes, seeing not just a stranger who shared her name, but a connection to the very gift that had enabled her to save Whitmore's life. "He trained horses?" "The best I ever saw," Whitmore said, his voice thick with memory and something approaching shame. "He had a way with them that seemed almost magical. Could gentle the wildest mustang, could read a horse's mood like other men read newspapers. Thunder was one of the colts he trained from birth." Esther's careful composure finally cracked. "You remember Samuel?" she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Of course I remember him," Whitmore replied. He paused, struggling with words that were long overdue. "He was a good man, An honest man? When he died in that accident on my ranch, I should have. The sentence hung unfinished in the suddenly heavy air. Clara looked between her mother and Whitmore, sensing undercurrents of history she had never known existed. What accident? She asked quietly. Esther closed her eyes, as if the telling would cause physical pain. Your father was breaking a new horse when it threw him. The fall broke his neck. He died instantly. It happened on my land, Whitmore added, his voice barely above a whisper. He was working for me when he died. I should have taken care of you both afterward. Should have made sure you had what you needed. But He stopped, unable to finish the confession of his own moral cowardice. The truth settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Clara's natural ability with thunder hadn't been beginner's luck or divine intervention. It had been inheritance. A gift passed down from a father she barely remembered to a daughter who had never known about her legacy. The courage that had enabled her to leap onto a panicked horse and risk everything to save a stranger's life had been bred into her bones. That's why thunder responded to you, Whitmore said, his voice filled with wonder. He knew. Somehow he recognized Samuel in you. Clara stared at the photograph, seeing her father's confident stance beside the horse and understanding for the first time where her instinctive connection with animals had originated. Mama, why didn't you tell me? Because it hurt too much to remember, Esther said simply. And because I wanted to protect you from hoping for a life that might never be possible. Whitmore stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Main Street. Below, clusters of townspeople were still gathered, their upturned faces making it clear that his unprecedented visit was the subject of intense speculation. When he turned back to face Esther and Clara, his expression carried a resolve that hadn't been there minutes before. I failed your family once, he said, his words carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated guilt. I let pride and social convention prevent me from doing what honor demanded. I won't make that mistake again. Mr. Whitmore, you don't need to, Esther began. Yes, I do, he interrupted gently but firmly. Clara has her father's gift with horses, and she's proven she has the courage to use it. If you'll permit it, Mrs. Washington, I'd like to teach her everything her father would have taught her himself. I'd like to honor his memory by ensuring his daughter has every opportunity he would have wanted for her. The offer hung in the air like a bridge spanning 2 worlds, the world of limitation that Clara had always known, and a world of possibility that had never seemed within reach. In proposing to train her properly, Whitmore was offering to tear down the very social barriers that had kept him from acknowledging her existence for 12 years. The whole town will talk, Esther warned. Let them talk, Whitmore replied. Some conversations are long overdue. Clara looked at the faded photograph of her father, then at her mother's anxious face, then at the man who was offering to change the trajectory of her entire life. In the space of 24 hours, she had discovered she possessed a gift she never knew existed, learned about a father she barely remembered, and been offered an opportunity that would have seemed impossible just yesterday. I'd like that very much. Mr. Whitmore, she said with the same directness that had guided her actions on Thunder's back. I think Papa would have liked it too. By noon, every soul in Clearwater Springs knew about Whitmore's visit to the Washington family, and by evening, the bronze bell in the town square was ringing with the urgent rhythm that called the community together for matters of grave importance. The bell had summoned them for Indian raids and prairie fires, for elections and emergencies, but never for anything quite like this. Debate about whether a wealthy white rancher should be allowed to train a young black girl in the art of horsemanship. Mrs. Crawford had organized the opposition with the efficiency of a military campaign. She stood on the steps of the town hall, her black dress rustling with indignation as she addressed the growing crowd. This is about more than one little girl, she declared, her voice carrying across the square. This is about the natural order of things, about maintaining the stability that has kept our community peaceful and prosperous. A murmur of agreement rippled through part of the crowd. but it was met by equally vocal dissent from another quarter. The town was dividing along lines that had been invisible just days before, fault lines in the community's soul that had been exposed by Clara's act of courage. Sheriff Kane stood near the bell, his weathered face reflecting the discomfort of a man who preferred his problems simple and his solutions straightforward. "Folks," he called out, his voice cutting through the competing conversations, "let's keep this civil. We're here to discuss a situation, not start a war." Inside the hall, the wooden benches filled quickly as families claimed seats according to invisible but well-understood tribal loyalties. The Petersons sat with the Muellers and the Harrisons, working families who had witnessed Clara's bravery firsthand. The Crawfords anchored a cluster of merchants and bankers who viewed the proposed arrangement as a dangerous precedent. Dr. Matthews took a seat in the front row, his medical bag at his feet, and his expression suggesting he was prepared to treat either wounded bodies or wounded consciences. Whitmore entered the hall with Clara and Esther flanking him, their presence together causing a ripple of whispers that swept through the assembled crowd like wind through wheat. Clara wore her best dress, the blue calico that her mother had sewn for church services, but she carried herself with a new confidence that had nothing to do with clothing. The girl who had been invisible just 2 days before now commanded the attention of every person in the room. "Before we begin," Whitmore said, rising to address the assembly, "I want to be clear about what I'm proposing. Miss Clara Washington saved my life through courage and skill that would have been remarkable in a grown man, let alone a 12-year-old child. I've learned that her father, Samuel Washington, was one of the finest horsemen who ever worked for me. I believe Clara has inherited that gift, and I intend to honor both her courage and her father's memory by teaching her everything he would have taught her himself." "And who gave you the right to overturn the way things have always been done?" demanded Mr. Williams from the back of the room. "Some of us have been living in this town a lot longer than you, Whitmore, and we've seen what happens when folks start getting ideas above their station." "Ideas above their station?" Dr. Matthews stood slowly, his calm voice carrying an edge of steel that surprised many who knew him as a gentle healer. "Are we talking about the idea that courage should be rewarded? Or the idea that a child who saves a life deserves recognition? Perhaps you could clarify which idea you find so threatening." The tension in the room thickened like smoke from a green fire. Clara felt every eye on her, some friendly, some hostile, all of them measuring her against expectations and prejudices she was only beginning to understand. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing the weight of being truly visible, and the burden was heavier than she had ever imagined. "This isn't about the child," Mrs. Crawford said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "This is about maintaining proper boundaries. When we start making exceptions for one, where does it end? What's next? Demanding equal schooling? Equal seating in church? Equal treatment under God's eyes?" Interrupted Martha Patterson, rising from her seat with fire in her voice. "Equal recognition for equal courage? Equal respect for equal worth? Yes, Mrs. Crawford, that's exactly what's next, and it's long overdue." The hall erupted in competing voices, some shouting support for Patterson's words, while others demanded order and tradition. Sheriff Kane banged his gavel repeatedly, but the bronze bell's call for assembly had unleashed emotions that had been buried beneath the surface of polite society for too long. "Listen to yourselves," called out Jake Harrison, his blacksmith's voice cutting through the chaos. 2 days ago, this little girl did what none of us had the courage to do. She risked her life to save a man she barely knew, rode a horse she'd never mounted, and got him to safety when the rest of us were standing around like fence posts. Now we're debating whether she deserves to learn from the man she saved. "It's not about deserving," Mr. Williams shot back. "It's about knowing your place in the world. Some folks are born to certain positions, and some aren't. That's just the way things are." "The way things are," Clara said quietly, her voice somehow carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall, "is that when someone needs help, you help them. That's what my mama taught me, and that's what my papa would have wanted me to do." She stood slowly, her small figure dwarfed by the adult crowd around her, but her presence somehow filling the entire space. I don't know much about positions or places or any of that, but I know Thunder trusted me when he was scared, and I know Mr. Whitmore would have died if someone hadn't acted. Maybe that someone should have been somebody else, somebody more proper or more suited to it. But it wasn't. It was me. The hall remained silent as Clara continued, her words carrying the simple honesty that had disarmed Whitmore the day before. Mr. Whitmore wants to teach me about horses because my papa trained horses and because he thinks I have a gift for it. That seems like a kindness to me, not a threat to anybody. I don't understand why kindness should scare people. Esther reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes bright with tears and pride. In the space of 3 days, she had watched Clara transform from an invisible child to a young woman who could face down a room full of hostile adults with nothing but truth and courage. "The girl makes a fair point," admitted Tom Mueller's father. "We're sitting here debating whether to punish courage and reward cowardice. Seems to me we've got our priorities backward." "This isn't about punishment," Mrs. Crawford insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "This is about maintaining the social fabric that holds our community together." "What kind of fabric is held together by keeping people apart?" asked Dr. Matthews. "What kind of community defines its strength by limiting the potential of its children?" Whitmore stood again, his presence commanding attention through sheer force of personality and wealth. "I want to tell you all something," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. "Yesterday, when I was dying in that saddle, I wasn't thinking about social fabric or proper places or any of the things we're debating tonight. I was thinking about how I'd wasted my life worrying about things that don't matter when I should have been paying attention to things that do." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "Clara Washington has more courage and character than most adults I know. Her father was a good man who died working for me, and I failed to honor his memory or take care of his family when he was gone. I'm not going to make that mistake again. And if we object," challenged Mr. Williams, "if we decide this arrangement isn't good for our community, then you'll have to decide whether you're the kind of community that rewards courage or punishes it," Whitmore replied. "Whether you're the kind of people who help each other up or hold each other down, because that's really what this is about. Not Clara's place in your world, but what kind of world you want this to be." The bronze bell outside continued its measured tolling, marking time for a community standing at a crossroads between the world it had always known and the world it might become. Clara sat quietly between her mother and the man whose life she had saved, waiting for the verdict that would determine not just her own future, but the very soul of Clearwater Springs. In the growing dusk outside, the desert wind stirred the dust of Main Street, carrying with it the promise of change, whether the people inside the hall were ready for it or not. The tension in the hall reached a breaking point as voices rose and tempers flared beyond. Sheriff Kane's ability to control what had begun as a community discussion was transforming into something uglier, with lines being drawn that would define Clearwater Springs for generations to come. "This has gone far enough," Mr. Williams declared, rising from his seat with fists clenched. "I won't stand by and watch this town turned upside down by some fool notion about equality." "Then maybe you should sit down and shut up," Jake Harrison shot back, his blacksmith's frame unfolding as he stood to face Williams across the aisle. The confrontation escalated quickly as supporters from both sides began shouting over each other, their voices creating a chaos that drowned out Sheriff Kane's calls for order. In the midst of the verbal storm, Clara sat quietly beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floor as adult fury swirled around her small figure. "Look at her," Mrs. Crawford said, pointing a finger at Clara with theatrical disgust. "Sitting there like she belongs in decent company. Some people need to be reminded of their place." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each syllable designed to diminish and humiliate. For 12 years, she had been protected from such direct hostility by her invisibility. But now her visibility made her a target for prejudices that had been festering beneath Clearwater Springs' polite surface. "My place," Clara said, standing slowly despite her mother's restraining hand, "is wherever I choose to make it, just like yours is." The simple declaration sent a shockwave through the hall. Mrs. Crawford's face flushed red with anger at being addressed so directly by someone she considered beneath acknowledgement, while others leaned forward in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after everyone present had turned to dust. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Mrs. Crawford hissed, moving toward Clara with a hostility that made Esther rise protectively beside her daughter. "She has every right to speak," Dr. Matthews said firmly, positioning himself between the banker's wife and the Washington family. "This is still America, last I checked, and courage still deserves respect." But Mrs. Crawford was beyond reason now, her carefully maintained facade of genteel superiority cracking under the pressure of having her worldview challenged by a child. "You people need to remember your place," she spat, reaching out to grab Clara's arm with enough force to tear the sleeve of her blue calico dress. The sound of ripping fabric seemed to freeze everyone in the hall for a heartbeat. Clara looked down at her torn sleeve. The dress her mother had sewn with such care for church services, now damaged by hatred, and something shifted in her expression. The quiet acceptance that had characterized her response to hostility transformed into something harder and more determined. "My dress is torn," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "But my spirit isn't." Whitmore exploded into motion, placing himself between Clara and Mrs. Crawford with a protective fury that surprised everyone present, including himself. "If you touch that child again," he said in a voice cold as winter wind, "you'll answer to me personally." The hall erupted as people chose sides with the finality of soldiers picking uniforms. The divide was no longer about Clara's right to learn horsemanship. It had become about the fundamental question of human dignity and whether courage could transcend the artificial barriers society had constructed. "This is madness," shouted Mr. Williams, but his voice was matched by others who had found their courage in Clara's example. "The only madness," called out Mrs. Patterson, her voice rising above the chaos, "is treating a hero like a pariah because of the color of her skin." Sheriff Kane finally restored order by firing his pistol into the air, the sharp crack of gunpowder silencing the crowd with its promise of official intervention. "That's enough," he declared, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between duty and conscience. "We're here to make a decision, not start a riot." Clara stood in the center of the storm, her torn dress a visible reminder of the ugliness that had been exposed, but her posture straight and unbroken. She looked around the hall at faces that revealed the full spectrum of human nature, some twisted with hatred, others bright with admiration, many simply confused by the magnitude of change being demanded of them. "I never asked for any of this," she said, her young voice somehow carrying more authority than all the adult shouting that had preceded it. "I just saw someone who needed help and I helped them. If that makes me uppity or dangerous or whatever else you want to call me, then I guess that's what I am." She paused, touching the torn fabric of her sleeve before continuing. "But courage doesn't come in colors, and neither does kindness. My papa trained horses for Mr. Whitmore because he was good at it, not because of what he looked like. I saved Mr. Whitmore's life because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted to upset anybody or change anything." The hall had fallen completely silent now, every person present recognizing that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a moment of absolute moral clarity delivered by someone too young to understand the impossibility of what she was attempting. "Maybe the real question," Clara continued, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water, "isn't whether I deserve to learn from Mr. Whitmore, but whether this town deserves to have people in it who help each other when help is needed." The torn blue calico dress, damaged by hatred but worn by courage, had become a symbol of something larger than its wearer. In that small piece of ripped fabric, Clearwater Springs could see its own soul reflected, torn between its comfortable prejudices and its professed values, between the easy path of maintaining the status quo and the difficult road toward becoming the community it claimed to be. In the profound silence that followed Clara's words, Whitmore reached up and removed his hat, the cream-colored Stetson that had crowned his head like a symbol of authority for as long as anyone in Clearwater Springs could remember. The hat was more than headwear. It was a badge of status, a mark of respectability that commanded deference wherever it appeared. He had inherited it from his father, just as he had inherited the silver pocket watch and the sprawling ranch that made him the most powerful man in the territory. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo through history. "You've earned something that can't be bought or inherited or granted by birth. You've earned the right to be treated with the respect that courage deserves." With deliberate ceremony, Whitmore placed the hat on Clara's small head. The gesture was so unprecedented, so shocking in its implications, that the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The cream-colored Stetson, sized for a grown man's head, settled over Clara's dark hair like a crown. Too large for her, but somehow fitting perfectly in its symbolism. The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Mrs. Crawford gasped as if she had witnessed a blasphemy, her hand flying to her throat in shock. Several other townspeople rose from their seats and headed for the door, their exit speaking volumes about their unwillingness to accept what they had just witnessed. But for every person who left in disgust, another nodded in approval or wiped away unexpected tears. "I'll be damned," breathed Tom Mueller's father, his voice filled with something approaching awe. "Never thought I'd see the day." Clara reached up to touch the brim of the hat, feeling the smooth felt beneath her fingertips, and understanding instinctively that she was holding more than an article of clothing. The hat represented acceptance, recognition, and a public declaration that her worth was not determined by the color of her skin or the circumstances of her birth. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, "I don't know if I'm worthy of this." "Worthiness isn't something others give you," Whitmore replied, his voice carrying a wisdom that surprised even him. "It's something you prove through your actions. You've already proven yours." Dr. Matthews stood slowly, his movement deliberate and considered. "I want it known," he announced to the remaining crowd, "that I fully support Mr. Whitmore's decision. This community needs more people like Clara Washington, not fewer. If teaching her horsemanship helps develop her natural gifts, then we should be grateful for the opportunity to witness it." Sheriff Kane cleared his throat, his weathered face showing the resolve of a man who had made his choice after careful consideration. "Miss Clara," he said formally, "you have my word that any person who attempts to interfere with this arrangement will answer to the law. You've done nothing but good for this community, and you deserve the chance to become everything you're capable of becoming. The formation of this unlikely alliance, a wealthy rancher, a respected doctor, and the town sheriff all standing publicly behind a 12-year-old black girl, sent shockwaves through the social structure of Clearwater Springs. Lines were being redrawn in real time, and everyone present understood that the community would never be quite the same again. "There'll be talk," warned Mrs. Patterson, though her tone suggested she supported their decision despite the social consequences. "Let there be talk," Whitmore replied, extending his hand to Clara in a gesture that completed the public ceremony of recognition. "Sometimes talk is exactly what a community needs." Clara took his offered hand with her small one, the handshake witnessed by dozens of people who would remember and retell this moment for the rest of their lives. The contrast between their hands, his large and weathered from years of ranch work, hers small and soft from a life of sewing and domestic tasks, somehow emphasized the courage it had taken for both of them to bridge the gap between their worlds. Esther watched her daughter with tears streaming down her face, seeing in Clara's straight posture and determined expression the echo of Samuel's courage and dignity. The torn dress sleeve seemed insignificant now compared to the symbolic weight of Whitmore's hat resting on Clara's head. "When do we start?" Clara asked, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact determination that had guided her actions on Thunder's back. "Tomorrow morning," Whitmore replied without hesitation. "Your education begins at sunrise." As the crowd began to disperse, some grumbling about the changes thrust upon them, while others whispered excitedly about the precedent being set. Clara remained standing in the center of the hall, wearing a hat that transformed her from invisible child to visible symbol of possibility. The bronze bell outside had fallen silent, its call to assembly complete, but the reverberations of what had occurred within the hall would continue to ring through Clearwater Springs for years to come. A young girl who had saved a life with courage and compassion had been publicly recognized and rewarded by the most powerful man in their community. And in that recognition, the town had glimpsed what it might become if it chose courage over comfort. Justice over tradition. Clara Washington, wearing Jefferson Whitmore's hat like a crown of thorns and triumph, had become more than herself. She had become proof that change was possible, even in places where change seemed impossible. The invisible girl had found her visibility not through demanding it, but through earning it one act of courage at a time. 3 months later, the autumn sun painted Clearwater Springs in shades of gold and amber, as Clara Washington cantered Thunder through the main street with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. The same townspeople who had once debated her right to learn now paused in their daily routines to watch her pass, many nodding with approval that had grown from grudging acceptance to genuine respect. The girl who had once gripped Thunder's reins in desperate terror now handled them with the natural grace her father had possessed, her small hands steady and sure as she guided the magnificent stallion through his paces. Every movement spoke of hours spent learning not just the mechanics of riding, but the deeper art of communication between human and horse that could not be taught from books or lectures. Whitmore rode beside her on a gentle mare named Patience, his own transformation as remarkable as Clara's, the man who had once driven himself toward an early grave with stress and isolation, now moved with the relaxed bearing of someone who had rediscovered joy in simple pleasures. His heart condition remained serious, but regular medication, moderate exercise, and the unexpected gift of meaningful companionship had given him back years he thought he had lost. "Remember to keep your weight centered," he called out as they approached the turn toward his ranch. "Thunder can feel every shift in your balance." "I know," Clara called back with a grin that would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. "He tells me when I'm doing it wrong." Their unlikely partnership had weathered the initial storm of community resistance and emerged stronger for having been tested. Some relationships in Clearwater Springs had been permanently altered. Mrs. Crawford still crossed the street rather than acknowledge Clara's existence, but others had been strengthened by the revelation of character that crisis often provides. Dr. Matthews had become a regular visitor to the Whitmore ranch, ostensibly to monitor the rancher's health, but actually to witness the remarkable progress of his most unusual patient. Sheriff Kane made a point of riding out weekly to ensure Clara's safety, though her growing reputation as a skilled horsewoman had largely silenced her critics. Most importantly, Esther Washington had watched her daughter blossom from a careful, invisible child into a confident young woman who rode through town with her head high and her future stretching before her like an open road. The torn blue dress from that night in the town hall had been carefully mended and stored away as a reminder of how far they had all traveled. "She's got more natural ability than any student I've ever taught," Whitmore confided to Dr. Matthews during one of their regular conversations. "Sometimes I think Samuel is looking down at us, proud of what his daughter has become." Today carried special significance beyond their regular training routine. Word had spread through town that Whitmore had commissioned something unprecedented from the leather worker in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. a custom saddle crafted specifically for Clara, sized to her small frame, but built with the same quality materials reserved for the finest riders. As they approached the ranch, Clara could see a small crowd gathered in the main yard. Jake Harrison was there with his wife, along with the Mueller family and several others who had supported her from the beginning. Even Mr. Peterson had closed his store early to attend what everyone understood was more than just the presentation of a saddle. It was a celebration of how much their community had grown. The saddle itself was a work of art, crafted from rich brown leather that gleamed with careful oiling and detailed with silver conchos that caught the afternoon light. It sat on a wooden stand in the center of the yard, like a throne, waiting for its rightful occupant. And Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw the careful craftsmanship that had gone into creating something so beautiful for her. "Miss Clara," Whitmore said formally, dismounting from Patience and offering his hand to help her down from Thunder. "This saddle represents more than just a gift. It represents your place in this community as an accomplished rider and a person of courage and character." Clara slid down from Thunder's back and approached the saddle with reverence, running her fingers over the smooth leather and marveling at the silver nameplate that bore her initials in elegant script. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then louder. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you all." "The thanks belong to you," Dr. Matthews said, stepping forward from the gathered crowd. "You've shown us all what courage looks like, and you've made this community a better place by being part of it." As Clara ran her hands over the saddle that would carry her toward a future she could never have imagined just 3 months earlier, she thought about the chain of choices that had brought them all to this moment. One decision to help instead of watching, one moment of courage instead of fear, had created ripples that continued to spread through every life they touched. "Would you like to try it out?" Whitmore asked, and Clara nodded eagerly. As they fitted the custom saddle to Thunder's back, Clara noticed a young boy watching from the edge of the crowd, Tommy Rodriguez, the Mexican laborer's son who'd been hanging around the ranch lately, his dark eyes bright with longing as he watched the horses. "Tommy!" Clara called out, surprising everyone, including herself. "Would you like to learn to ride too?" The boy's face lit up with hope and disbelief, and Whitmore found himself nodding approval before he had fully processed the implications of what Clara was suggesting. But looking at her confident posture and remembering his own transformation over the past months, he realized that she was ready to pass on what she had learned. "I think that's an excellent idea," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who had discovered that breaking barriers became easier with practice. Every good rider should learn to teach others. As the sun set over Clearwater Springs that evening, Clara rode through town on Thunder with her custom saddle gleaming beneath her and young Tommy Rodriguez walking alongside, already dreaming of the day he would ride beside her. The girl who had once been invisible now blazed like a beacon of possibility, proof that sometimes the smallest hands really do hold the strongest hearts. The desert wind carried the sound of Thunder's hooves through the gathering dusk, a rhythm that spoke of journeys completed and journeys yet to begin. In learning to ride, Clara had taught an entire community to fly, and in saving one life, she had transformed dozens of others. Sometimes courage is just doing what needs to be done, one choice at a time, until the impossible becomes inevitable and the invisible becomes unforgettable. In Clearwater Springs, they would remember this truth long after the dust settled and the stories became legend, passed down through generations of children who would learn that bravery comes in all colors and all sizes, and that the power to change the world often rests in the smallest, most unexpected hands.